Dr. Nancy Hinkle from University of Georgia is going to talk to us about external pest control.
Thank you so much for your invitation to join your group tonight. I really appreciate it. And something tells me you folks down in South Georgia have been seeing a lot of flies already. We had a cool spring for a while, and then all of a sudden it turned into summer all of a sudden, seemed like. We've had hot weather here in Athens for the last week or two. So tonight we're going to talk about external insect pest control, as Dr. Whitley said. And I'd like to start off talking about the plain old horn fly. If you hear anybody talking about flies on their cattle, usually what they mean is the horn fly. These are flies that suck blood. Every one of them has to suck blood, and they suck blood frequently. They've got to have a blood meal about once an hour or more frequently, and this is day and night. They never leave the cow. So they're on their animal even at night, taking blood meals, sucking blood. And they don't take a whole big volume of blood, but they do it frequently, which is very uncomfortable for the animals, as you can appreciate. They, again, feed only on blood. They cannot drink water. They have to get all of their nutrients and their moisture from the blood that they consume. So they have to feed on the cow, and they feed only on cattle. You may see them on horses, but they can't survive on horse blood. They'll be feeding on horses perhaps, but they can't reproduce on horse blood. So again, they're on the animal all the time, around the clock. And they can, as you see, be in very large numbers. I hope you haven't seen this on your herd. We do know that they cost us something, and it's not usually the adult cows that are affected so much. It's more the calves, because the calves are dependent on the mother cow for the nutrition that they get. And if you think about it, and you may have seen this on your own herd, the poor calf is out there suckling, and the mama cow is being irritated by the flies on her belly. And so she starts kicking at the flies on her belly and ends up kicking the poor calf in its head, and the calf backs up and goes, well, what did I do? Which makes the calf less eager to feed, because it's being punished every time it goes to the udder. So the calves that are affected by large populations of horn flies on the mother cow are putting on less weight, and we see this in returns on the weaning weight of the animal. Now, horn flies only come from manure, and only from cattle manure. They cannot reproduce in horse manure or dog droppings or any other animal waste. It's only from bovine droppings. So this is where we know that all of them come from. If you can think of a way to keep cows from defecating, we can eliminate the horn fly problem. But so far, nobody's come up with a good strategy for that. But every one of the horn flies out there are developed in the manure pad. The larvae come from little eggs. This is a batch of fly eggs here. The larvae hatch out of the eggs. This is what a fly larva looks like, also known as a maggot. The pointed end over on the right is the head end. So that's the end that's down in the manure pad eating. The blunt end is usually stuck up where they can actually get oxygen. They breathe through their rear end. So they're able to eat with the front end and breathe with the rear end all at the same time. So they don't have the same problem I do of sometimes trying to inhale when I got a mouthful of food and ended up choking myself. All of that occurs in the manure pad. And then they go through the next stage of metamorphosis, in which the larva or maggot turns into the pupal stage. Now, they don't spin a cocoon out of silk like caterpillars do. Instead, they just form a hard shell around the outside of the body called the pupal case. So they go from that structure you see over on the far left, the maggot. It just gets shorter and stubbier, as you see in the second there. It's still the same color as the maggot, but it's much shorter. And you can see the little lines around it where the portions of the maggot, these little rings that they have around them, they don't have legs, they don't have ears or eyes or anything. Maggots are pretty simple little creatures, but they've got these little rings around their body. And in those rings you can see are the dirty parts in the pupal case there. Then over the next few days, that pupal case gets darker, goes through a kind of a reddish-brown stage, and then just before the adult fly emerges from the pupal case, it's almost pure black. Now, anybody walking out in their pasture and seeing these is going to think they're just some kind of plant part, maybe a seed or something. We never associate something that looks like this with the flies that end up on our cattle. But this is where all of those flies come from. They have to go through these stages, and then they emerge as adult flies. Now, you got to think that it's pretty amazing that something as nondescript as a maggot, over here on the far left, can turn into something that looks like a fly with 6 legs and a head and wings and antennae and eyes. It's quite a dramatic change. So again, the adult flies then have to find a cow to start feeding on. They stick their mouth parts down in there and they start feeding. Again, they don't take a large volume of blood, but they do it very frequently. So they're constantly irritating the animal. And the animal is disturbed by this. You've seen them slinging their heads, stamping their feet, kicking their bellies, anything to try to get these flies to leave them alone. We've conducted a good bit of research on horn flies just because they are such a ubiquitous pest. They're not just found here in the Southeast. They're a problem throughout North America. Anywhere there are cattle, there are horn flies. But we have a very long horn fly season here in the Southeast. In fact, there are folks in South Georgia that swear that they never get rid of flies. They've got flies on Christmas Day and they've got flies on Valentine's Day. They never go away. And I think some winters they may be right. So we've been working on what we can do to control horn flies. We've been testing products that are available and seeing how they can be most effectively used. We tested ear tags, and there are, of course, a good variety of ear tags on the market. You may have noticed that this year we have fewer options than we've had in the past because the EPA has withdrawn a couple of the organophosphate products that we used to have available. They're no longer available for our use. And so we've got fewer options than we've had in the past. The results are in the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. If you're not familiar with this, you might want to consider looking it up. You can buy it for, I think it's about $70 now, which is an awful lot, I consider. Or you can go online and Google Georgia Pest Management Handbook and get it for free. Just download the sections that you want. Now, it has every crop that's grown in Georgia and the pesticides that are registered for use on that crop. So if you're growing corn, you can go to the corn section. If you got soybeans, you go to the soybean section. If you got a backyard garden, you can go to the pole bean section. You can go to peas or okra, whatever you're growing, you can find what insecticides are registered for use on that crop. If you're interested in cattle, go to the animals section and then go to the beef cattle, and you can find all of the insecticides that are registered in the state of Georgia for controlling pests on beef cattle. So again, we tested a variety of controls. These are the larvicides, the products that can be fed to the cow that go through the cow's digestive system and come out in the manure so that any fly eggs that are laid in that manure are killed. Now, I think I heard Mr. Copeland talking about using Clarifly. That's one of these products here. In fact, it's in the same category over here as this one with the Dimilin or diflubenzuron. That's the active ingredient in these products. That's an insect growth regulator. It doesn't kill adult flies. It only kills the immature stages. And that's why it's directly applied to the manure. It comes out in the manure. It prevents maggots from being able to develop in that manure pad. A similar product is Alticid. Here's a variety of products that contain the Alticid active ingredient, also known as methoprene. That again can be fed through. It can come as a mineral block, loose minerals. There are a variety of different ways that it can be administered. And then by comparison, we compared this product over here in the lower right-hand corner, the fly block with Rabon. Now, this is also a feed-through larvicide, so the cow eats it, or in this case, licks on the salt block, consumes the active ingredient. It passes through the gastrointestinal tract and comes out in the manure. But instead of being an insect growth regulator, Rabon is actually an organophosphate insecticide. And you may be shocked to hear that we are deliberately feeding our beef animals an organophosphate insecticide, and that the EPA furthermore lets us get away with it. This is legal to be sold. It's sold around the country. And the reason it can be is because Rabon is never digested. It stays in the GI tract. It goes through the stomach, through the intestines. It comes out in the manure. It is never digested. It never gets into the circulatory system, never gets into the blood, never gets into the muscle. It stays in the stomach and the intestines, which is what we want it to do. We want it to come out in the manure. The same way with the Dimilin and the Alticid, these products also are consumed, pass through the stomach, pass through the intestines, come out in the manure. Again, that's what we want it to do. We want it to come out in the manure because that's where the maggots are going to be developing. That's where we want the active ingredient to be. And that means that every manure pat coming from those animals, the animals that have consumed these products, contains the active ingredient. So no flies should be able to develop in that manure. No maggots should be able to survive that manure. No matter if adult female flies come in, lay eggs in that manure pat, the eggs may hatch, but those larvae will not be able to develop in that manure. So that's one strategy for killing flies. You kill them early in their lives. As soon as they hatch from the egg, they die. Now, this works really well if you have a herd that's isolated, if you're not near any other cattle producers. However, if you share a fence line with someone who's not doing a good job controlling his flies, there is absolutely nothing to stop his flies from coming across the fence and getting on your cattle. They may not be able to reproduce on your property, but they certainly can feed on your cows and make your cows miserable. So this may be an option for a lot of people, especially if they've got some isolation from other herds. But boy, if you've got a bad neighbor and a neighbor that's not doing a good job controlling his cows' flies, then you're probably going to share his flies, unfortunately. And again, remember, this does not affect adult flies. It does not get in the blood, so the flies can feed on that cow as much as they want to, and it will not affect them in the least. They never get any insecticide that way. The insecticide, of course, is deep down inside. It's in the stomach of the cow. It's in the intestines of the cow. It's coming out in the manure. It is never in the meat. It is never in the blood. We also looked at this device. If you're familiar with the vet gun, it's a lot of fun. My students loved the vet gun. They would fight over who got to use the vet gun every time we went out. And this is kind of a paintball-like device, a paintball gun-like device that shoots little balls, and inside these hollow balls, there's an insecticide. When these little balls hit a cow, the ball gets crushed, and the contents exude out and adhere to the coat of the animal. And all of these are formulated to be dissolved in oil. So as soon as they hit the cow, they start to wick through the fur of the animal or through the coat of the animal. And they will distribute over the entire coat of the animal just passively because they are dissolved in oils. And this oil will just move around the coat of the animal, dissolving in the skin oils of the animal itself. So even though you shoot the animal on the left side, within 12 to 24 hours, the entire body, the belly, the rear end, the right side, up around the head, all of those are going to have the active ingredient as well as the site that got hit with the paintball. Now, I want to warn you that the product that's delivered by this vet gun is exactly the same active ingredient as is found in the Sabre Poron. You're probably familiar with this product. It's lambda-cyhalothrin. It's also available in several other products such as Sayonara. In fact, if you use the Sayonara Poron, it comes to a cost of about 67 cents a head. By comparison, the AIM vet caps are $2.50 a head. And of course, you have to also buy the vet gun itself. And you've got to have the CO2 cylinders to cause the projectiles to be ejected from the gun. In this cow, you can see that red dot on its shoulder there. That's where the paintball, I keep calling it a paintball, but of course that's what's actually carrying the insecticide. Anyway, it has hit that animal right behind the front shoulder there, and it has ruptured and is releasing the insecticide onto the coat of the animal. Now you can see this animal's got her tail up. She's a little disturbed there. She noticed it. She felt it. It was not painful, but it got her attention. So this may not work for herds where the animals are high-strung and ready to head for the backside of the place at any provocation. If you've got a reasonably sedate herd, if they're passive, not easily riled, then you shouldn't have any trouble using the vet gun. But it does depend on animal demeanor and their degree of placidness, I guess. As I mentioned, this lambda-cyhalothrin active ingredient is also available in several other products. You can find these again in the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. We really only have one new product that has come along in the beef market in the last couple of decades, and that's quite a comment. I think any of you who are farming in other areas, if you raise any row crops or such, you know that new products are coming out every year. You've got new active ingredients, new modes of action for the pests that you're dealing with in your crops. By comparison, in beef production, we only have one new product with one new mode of action in the last 2 decades. And this is it. You'll notice there the active ingredient is abamectin. This is one of the macrocyclic lactones related to ivermectin. So abamectin is a relative of ivermectin, same mode of action. The tag is called the XP820 tag. I don't know why they call it that, but that's what it's called, XP820. And it is available. It's on the market. It has a completely different mode of action from the tags that we used previously. So far we have not seen any insecticide resistance to the active ingredient in the XP820 tag. We also looked at other ways to apply the insecticide using plain old back rubbers, and these work just fine. They're a great way to apply an insecticide so long as the producer puts them up in the right place and remembers to keep them charged. You can't just put them up in May and expect them to last until October. You have to remember to go out there every week or two and recharge the back rubber. So you've got to dissolve the insecticide in oil, and this should be fresh oil. This should be number 2 diesel oil or mineral oil. It should not be used motor oil. We never, ever want to put used motor oil on an animal because there are heavy metals in the motor oil, and that can transfuse through the skin and end up contaminating our meat. And the last thing we want is for Georgia beef to get a bad reputation for having heavy metals in it. So use the diesel oil or the mineral oil, dissolve the insecticide, and then soak these back rubbers with that active ingredient mixed in the oil. And every time a cow walks under this, then the animal is self-treating. It's getting a little bit of that insecticide rubbed off on its back, which, as we saw from the pictures previously, is where hornflies generally hang out, at least until the heat of the day when they head down to the belly where they can get into some shade. So back rubbers work just fine as long as, again, the operator puts them in a place where the animals are going to use them and remembers to keep them charged with the insecticide. You can, of course, buy the commercial brands. These have the same mode of action. You've got the absorbent material there, and then the fly flips, or those floppy things hanging down, they kind of wick the insecticide down so that the animal's head gets covered as the animal walks through the back rubber. And then on the ends of the cable holding it up there, you also have dust bags there that also have insecticide in them, and as the animal bumps them moving through there, also gets a dose of insecticide. So there's several different ways to apply insecticides. Depends on your operation, what your preference is. Here's another one. The reservoir is up at the top there. You put the insecticide in there, and then it gradually wicks out, comes out through the dangly things there, so that every time an animal walks through that gap there, it gets treated to some of the insecticide. So there are many styles. You can order them or you can make your own. Now I want to talk about the insecticides that are available for use in these back rubbers. And here we're just going to concentrate on that central column, the one in dark blue there. If you'll notice the active ingredients listed, you see permethrin, permethrin, coumaphos, permethrin, phosmet, permethrin, tetrachlorovinphos, and dichlorophos. So you'll notice there that I've said permethrin an awful lot. Permethrin is in most of the products that are used for back rubbers. We do, however, have one other type of insecticide, the organophosphates, and that's why so many of these words have phos in them, like coumaphos and phosmet and dichlorophos. These are all organophosphates, but that means that we only have two modes of action for use in products for back rubbers. And that's not good news because we've been using organophosphates in one form or another for 50 or 60 years now, actually more than that. So we've got flies that are pretty resistant to organophosphates. We've only been using permethrin for maybe 30 or 40 years, but flies have seen it too. And because permethrin was so good when it first came on the market, everybody used it, which meant that every population of horned flies in the southeast has been exposed to permethrin. So we have pretty high levels of insecticide resistance to permethrin. And as I said, those are the only two options that we have for the back rubbers. So if you're not getting good control of the flies on your cattle using products on back rubbers, don't be surprised. Those flies have seen these products before, their grandparents did anyway, and they've gotten pretty resistant, and they may be very hard to control using the available products. Again, permethrin is a pyrethroid, so we've got resistance to pyrethroids, and then the organophosphates that I mentioned are the other option. So we know we have resistance to some of these products, and they are the only two types of products that we can use for cattle. Again, getting back to the Georgia Pest Management Handbook, if you go there, the way to use it is to look up in the upper left-hand corner and find the pest that you're concerned about. If you're concerned about stable flies, look for stable flies. If you're concerned about lice on your cattle, look for lice up there. Here we've got horn flies. Then that first column says ways to apply the insecticide. What do you prefer? Would you rather dust your animals? Do you want to use a pour-on? Do you want to use a spray? Do you want to use ear tags? Go down that column until you find the type of application you want to make. Then you can look in the second column, which lists the products that are available using that mode of action. So here we're looking at the injectable pour-on and spot-on products in that first column. And then you see we've got ivermectin as one product, or the brand name is Ivomec. We've got lambda-cyhalothrin, which is that Sabre product that I mentioned a little earlier. We've got moxidectin, which is marketed as moxidectin, cydectin pour-on. Then we've got permethrin products like Atraban D-Lice pour-on, or Brute pour-on, which is also permethrin. So that's how you use this product. And then over in the other columns, you see comments on how you can use this product, withdrawal times, and things like that. Notice down at the bottom of the page, the bolus and food additives. That's where the Clarifly and other products that contain the insect growth regulators would be listed. So we've got methoprene down here with the Alticid products, Clarifly with the diflubenzuron active ingredient. So that's how you use the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. It takes some getting used to, but it actually can be pretty useful once you get comfortable with it. Just to summarize, we really only have 4 types of insecticides that we can use on cattle. We've got those macrocyclic lactones that I mentioned, the ivermectin relatives, like abamectin, the XP820 tag, moxidectin, and so on. All of those are macrocyclic lactones. You're not going to be tested on this, so you don't have to know that. My students do, though. But doramectin, aprinamectin, moxidectin, all of those are macrocyclic lactones. They have one mode of action. Then we have the insect growth regulators, diflubenzuron and methoprene, and those are two classes 15 and 7A, and they have different modes of action. Then we have the organophosphates. I've listed a few of those already, the diazinon, tetrachlorovinphos, coumaphos, phosmet, naled, dichlorophos, bromophos-methyl, chlorpyrifos. Well, we don't have chlorpyrifos anymore. That's one EPA took away from us. And then we finally have the pyrethroids and pyrethrins. And I've listed a few of those already. They have a different mode of action. We recommend, of course, rotating insecticides, but we don't really mean rotating insecticides. What we mean is rotating modes of action. And here we only have 4 modes of action. So that means that if you've got resistance to one of these, that really reduces your options for rotating. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The EPA is not rushing to register new modes of action for us. They're very cautious about allowing pesticides to be used on food animals. And I don't see a lot of chemical companies rushing to get their products registered for use on food animals, probably because it costs them so much to get all the paperwork to justify it to the EPA. And unfortunately, we are considered a small market. Now, I think beef production in the United States is a pretty big market, but I guess when you compare it to the millions of acres of soybeans and the millions of acres of corn out there, we probably just don't quite measure up to that. Maybe the chemical companies don't see us as justifying their expenditures. I do want to mention here the difference. Pyrethrins are naturally occurring insecticides, and probably every household in North America has a package of pyrethrins of some sort. Usually it's a spray can with pyrethrins. These are great for spraying flying insects, for flies, wasps, anything that's flying around in the air. However, pyrethrins, because they are botanical, are not long-lived. They don't persist for very long. And they are very readily broken down by exposure to ultraviolet radiation, like sunlight. So if you spray pyrethrins on a cow and then you let the cow wander out in the pasture and get exposed to sunlight, that's going to break down that insecticide within minutes. So you get no residual activity. Yes, pyrethrins will kill the horn flies that it hits, but 5 minutes later, these horn flies can be walking all over where the pyrethrins were sprayed, and they're not affected in the least. So we don't use pyrethrins a whole lot on cattle. Instead, we use the pyrethroids. Now, these are the artificial ones, the ones that are made by humans, and they've been tweaked. We use the same general structure of the pyrethrins, but we add a few extra atoms onto them to make them more stable, so they don't break down when the sunlight hits them. And there's listed a few different active ingredients that we classify as pyrethroids. You probably recognize several of them: resmethrin, cyfluthrin, cypermethrin, phenvalerate. These are very common pyrethroids. But again, if you've got resistance to organophosphates and you've got resistance to pyrethroids, that pretty much leaves us the macrocyclic lactones and particularly the XP820 ear tags. That's the only long-term macrocyclic lactone that's available out there. And again, these are listed in the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. There's the link if you want to copy it down, but it's easier to just Google Georgia Pest Management Handbook, and it's easier to find that way. If you have any problem, contact your extension agent. Every extension office in the country knows how to find this, and they can send you the actual link or send you the pages that you're interested in. If you're only interested in hornfly control on beef cattle, they can send you those 6 or 8 pages easily. Now, while I've got you, I got to mention this new pest. You've probably heard that we've got a new tick in Georgia now. As of September last fall, we have a brand new tick, new to North America. It was first found in New Jersey back in 2017. And over the next 4 years, it gradually worked its way south, and it hit Georgia in the fall of 2021. It's the Asian longhorn tick. And there it is. There's a bunch of them on a leaf. And frankly, it looks like every other tick we've got in Georgia. Looks an awful lot like the Lone Star tick, which is the tick over on the right here. The scientific name is Emblyoma americanum, but this new tick is Haemaphysalis longicornis, the Asian longhorn tick over here on the left. Again, same size, pretty much same color, same shape and everything as our Lone Star tick. And here it is next to a penny, so you can see how small they are. Just a very common looking, nondescript, plain old tick. But we didn't need it. We already had 23 species of ticks. We really didn't need a new one, but we've got it anyway. The states with Asian longhorn ticks as of this month are shown here. As you can see, now we have in Georgia 2 different counties that have Asian longhorn ticks. Pickens County was the first place they were found, and then just last month they were found in Hall County as well. So we now have confirmed locations in Georgia. That's not to say that they're not in a lot of other places. It's like anything. If you're not looking for them, you're probably not going to find them. But I think when we start looking hard enough, we're going to turn up Asian longhorn ticks in other parts of Georgia as well. These out here in Arkansas and Missouri, there may actually be Lone Star ticks between there and Kentucky. We don't know. On the other hand, this tick may have been transported inadvertently by humans. We do ship a lot of cattle around the country, so possibly some cow was shipped from Tennessee out to Arkansas and carried a few longhorned ticks with them, and they got established in Arkansas or Missouri. We don't know how they got there, but we do know they're already there, and they're probably spreading just like they're already spreading in Georgia. Georgia was the 17th state to show up longhorn ticks and be positive for longhorn ticks. So we have that distinction. Why do we hate the longhorn tick? A lot of reasons. One is that it transmits a lot of different pathogens. These are pathogens that were transmitted back in its home location back in Asia. So far, it has been shown to transmit a couple of diseases here in North America as well. But again, it hasn't been here long enough for a lot of studies to be done, so we don't frankly know how many disease agents it will be capable of transmitting. But some of these are pretty nasty. The first one listed there, the severe fever, that's the human disease. That's the first one. The rest of them are cattle diseases: Anaplasma, Babesia, Borrelia, Ehrlichia, Rickettsia, and Theileria. All of those are animal diseases, and Theileria orientalis in particular is of concern because it's one that causes a severe malady in cattle where they develop severe anemia, and it can be life-threatening. It's only found in cattle, but it can be devastating to cattle herds. So we'll probably hear more about this. Here's a list of some of the most common hosts that has been found on here in North America. It's found primarily on dogs. That may be because we look at dogs the most. They're our close companions, but they're also very, very common on white-tailed deer. And of course, Georgia is generously blessed with white-tailed deer. So not only are they surviving on white-tailed deer, but as you can imagine, as deer migrate around, they're carrying these ticks around with them. So this may be one way that the Asian longhorn tick is being carried around the country. One thing we do know about these ticks is when they show up in very high numbers. So here's the rear end of a dead cow. This is the tail sticking off to the left here, and this is the area between the hips back here. And you can see we've got some blood-fed ticks that are very engorged and very swollen, and then we've got some ticks that have just started feeding as well. But as you can see, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of ticks on this poor animal. One thing I haven't mentioned about this tick is that it exhibits a trait called parthenogenesis. Again, you're not going to be tested on this, but what does parthenogenesis mean? It means it gives virgin birth. That means that every one of the eggs laid by this tick hatches into a female. There are only females. There are no male longhorn ticks. So these ticks don't have to mate. Each one of them is perfectly capable of laying eggs when she emerges as an adult tick. And each one of these ticks can lay up to 2,000 eggs per tick. Again, each one of those 2,000 eggs then hatches into a female, which is capable of laying another 2,000 eggs, of which all hatch into females capable of laying two. You get the idea. So the population can build to tremendous numbers, and that's probably why we see such numbers, such high numbers on the hosts that have been found to carry Asian longhorn ticks. And here's a headline in one of the newspapers in North Carolina: Asian longhorn ticks just drained a 5th North Carolina cow to death. This was back in 2019 when these ticks were just showing up in North Carolina, and the animals were found to have huge numbers of longhorn ticks on them, and the animals, 5 of them, as you see, were dead. We don't think they were actually drained, but probably they lost so much blood it produced anaphylactic shock or debilitation, or perhaps a toxemia. We don't know what's in the salivary secretions of this tick. Perhaps that's what's causing the death. Anyway, we know we don't want these ticks. We don't want them on our cattle. We don't want them on us or our children or our dogs. But we're going to have to deal with this tick. It's in Georgia now, so we're going to have to find ways to deal with it. Again, they show up in huge numbers. So if you start seeing numbers like this on your cattle, please report them to the Georgia State Vet's office. I'll give you the contact information in a minute. Fortunately, we do know that the insecticides that we use for other ticks appear to be efficacious against the Asian longhorn tick as well. So again, if you go to the Georgia Pest Management Handbook and look under ticks, you can find the tick control products. Here's just an example of a few of them. But again, these ticks should be reported to the Georgia State Veterinarian's Office. That's 404-656-3667. And again, wherever these ticks are found, the location in Pickens County, as we walked across the pastures there, huge numbers of these ticks were on every plant. It seemed like every plant in the pasture. So there you see about a dozen ticks on one small leaf. And you can imagine the possibilities when you have a whole pasture just crawling with ticks. This is not something we want to see, but to repeat it again, it's here and we're going to have to deal with it. So that's more than you wanted to know about the Asian longhorn tick. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but better to be forewarned, right? Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Hinkle. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I have a question. Do y'all have any data when it comes to the cost for horn flies per cow? I know I read something maybe 6 months ago that kind of break down if you have just say 100 horn flies on your cow and not being treated, that equates to so much loss per cow.
Right. People have tried to estimate that. It's estimated that on the broad scale, we lose over $1 billion every year countrywide to the horn fly. We estimate probably the bigger effect is actually on the calves, and we think that we're losing about 18 pounds of weight gain at weaning. So depending on the price of beef at that point, you can estimate what you're losing. Of course, that fluctuates, so it depends on what the market value is at that point. But we know we're losing weight, and we know that it justifies control. So investing in fly control products that are effective and that are used properly can justify the insecticide use.
Dr. Hinkle, do you have an estimate that says if you see so many flies per side, you probably should be investing in some way of controlling them?
That's an excellent question. We have argued over that as entomologists for years. The rule is if you see 200 flies per side on an animal, that justifies doing something. That's the trigger point. If you've got 200 flies per side of an animal, you should be treating that animal for fly control. Yes.
Is this picture about 200?
That's actually probably a little bit more. Yeah. 250, maybe 300 there. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's difficult to estimate because, especially if you wait till late in the day when the flies are down under the belly, it's really hard to count flies when they're hiding in the hair under a belly of a cow. So I recommend getting out early in the morning while it's still cool and the flies are still up on the back of the animal. That gives you a better chance of seeing them.
Dr. Hinkle, this is Lamar Berry. I did use the ear tags before, the Patriot, and they worked pretty good. But now, after listening to you now, I'm interested in this XP820. How long does that outlast the Patriot ear tag?
It can, depending on how resistant your flies are. We got 5 months of control using the XP820 tag. So that your results may vary. We know have to make that disclaimer. But we were pretty impressed with the XP820 tag, yes.
So, Dr. Hinkle, I have a question. I just wanted to reiterate. You said that, let's say I started using that XP820, the tags, and for 5 months, and then would it be prudent to rotate to a different type, let's say the vet gun, to try and control those horn flies?
If you do start seeing resistance, we recommend that. Otherwise, you can go for probably 2 or 3 years using the same class of insecticides. Usually for 2 or 3 years, we don't see resistance. But if you start seeing it, then we would highly recommend that you rotate to another mode of action.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was looking up some recommendations, and there was a recommendation to just use fly tags on cows and weaned calves, and that's understandable, but they said not on the bulls. Is that just because there's usually one bull or is there some issue with fertility, or is it, why would they not recommend use on bulls?
No, that's probably a philosophical issue. There's no worry about fertility, nothing, no physiological impact. One argument is that you let the bull suffer, since you're not going to be selling him for weight and you're not concerned about him producing calves or feeding calves. You let him suffer so that he can maintain flies that are susceptible. And then when those flies mate with the resistant flies, it helps to lower the level of resistance in the fly population.
Refugia.
Exactly, Dr. Whitley. That's the word. Exactly. Yes.
Sometimes we're just trying to kill flies. Understanding their life cycle gives us a better sense of how to come up with a strategy to control them. And so I think Dr. Nichols done a very good job of giving us some information, practical, understandable language.
Thank you, sir.
And know how to use it. So we appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. You couldn't give me higher praise than saying I said something useful. I do appreciate that.
But are there any biological controls out there that can be used for fly control as well?
You may have heard of the parasitic wasps that you can actually buy them. They're available commercially, but these are tiny little wasps. They're the size smaller than an eye gnat, and they're very fragile. So putting them out on an open pasture where they're exposed to winds and low humidity and sunlight exposure that dries them out, they're not going to function very well there. These little fly parasites work well in horse stables, maybe in chicken houses, maybe, but out on open pasture, they're just not effective at all. They can't fly far enough to find the next manure pat. And if they do, they're going to get blown about by the wind. They're going to be dried out by the low humidity, and the sunlight's going to bake them. So biological control for pasture pests is probably not where we're at, and we may not be there anytime soon. We do know that dung beetles work. We fortunately here in Georgia have good populations of dung beetles. Not good enough to eliminate flies, but imagine how bad the flies would be if we didn't have dung beetles. So treasure your dung beetles and try to keep them healthy. Other
Don't,
than that,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Don't your ivermectin products kill dung beetles though?
That's right. The macrocyclic lactones can be really rough on dung beetles.
And
So-
we use, I mean, you know, Dectomax is a product,
Right.
Actin product, and that is the recommended dewormer for just about everybody. That injectable, and then if you use the XP820s, then you got ivermectin in your ear tags too.
But fortunately, in the ear tags, it doesn't come out in the manure. So that's why the ear tags would be preferable to using the injectable or the feed through. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a risk. If you deworm in the winter when you don't have to worry about dung beetles, then you don't have to risk your dung beetles being affected by the ivermectin or its relatives. But if you use the Ivermec products in the middle of the summer when dung beetles are at their most active, that's a risk to the dung beetle population, the local dung beetle population anyway.
What about alternatives or natural products? Have you seen any proof?
No, and there has been evidence that if you crush garlic and you use that juice and you put it directly on flies, it will kill them. There is no evidence that if you feed that garlic to an animal and it comes out in the manure or it comes out in the blood, that it has any effect. My attitude is if the blood is healthy enough to keep the cow healthy and alive, then it's not going to kill any flies. If it's healthy enough for the cow, it's going to be healthy enough for the fly. So we haven't seen that, Dr. Whitley. It may be out there, but there's no evidence for it yet.
And I do want to warn people. I've seen it more in sheep and goat producers, but there's an old wives' tale that feeding sulfur in a sulfur block is good for parasite control, fly control, and tick control, and that you can actually kill your animals with too much sulfur. It can cause polio, vitamin B deficiency. It also can cause copper deficiency, which is going to make them more susceptible to parasite issues. So might just look out for that. Don't fall for that.
And another along those lines, actually overfeeding any of the garlic or onions or any of the allium species to cattle can produce the anemia called Heinz body anemia. Now, it has to be pretty high rates. It's not just feeding one garlic clove a day, but feeding large, high rates of any of the garlics, any of the leeks, or anything related to the onions can produce a medical condition that makes the animal sick.
I just joined in and I missed part of what you were saying about the ivermectin. You said that there is an ear tag for the ivermectin?
Not for ivermectins, but for a relative, one of the macrocyclic lactones. It's called XP820. The XP820 ear tag has a macrocyclic lactone in it.
Okay.
But it's at levels for fly control only, not for deworming.
Correct.
Okay, for fly control. Okay.
For fly control.
Dr. Hinkle, this is Paul Copeland. I've used those XP820 fly tags. And
yes, sir. What were your results?
Well, they were very good, but my results, I just went away from them simply because I just put too many tags in my cow's ear. You know, they look like they had earrings all in their ear after using those.
Right.
I think we got probably about 5 or 6 months out of them. They seem to work very well. But as I was saying, I've gone away from that using the Clarify Vitafirm mineral with a lot of other things in that to help the cows out. And what I've noticed in their dung and on their coat, they don't have nowhere near. I was out there yesterday and looked at them. They didn't have any flies on them, to be honest with you.
Ooh, you're doing something right. Wow.
I guess so, because I mean, you know, I don't spray them. We just put out the Clarify with the Vitafirm, and they are free reign, free choice on that. I usually keep a 50-pound bag per barrel each week, so it's 100 pounds per week. They don't get too much because there was about 75 cows out there eating off of that, and they empty that and it looks like they're shedding very well, no flies on them. You know, some of the calves I've noticed have been eating that pretty good as well.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
You must be pretty isolated. I presume you don't have a neighbor who's sharing his flies with you, huh?
The closest neighbor is probably 5 miles away, I guess.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Dr. Hinkle, do you recommend multiple applications? So in other words, using the IGRs with the fly tags, with the back rubs?
If you are controlling the flies with just one product, I'd say just go with one product. Now, some people are going to have a situation where the ear tags aren't going to work. They're going to need to add a spray, or they're going to need to add an insect growth regulator or something. So keep it as an option, but the best thing, of course, is just to use as little as you can when you need it.
Okay.
This is Rodney West. I have one question. We talked about fly control through back rubs, through mineral. Are there any findings for fly control through, say, liquid protein licks, the big tubs that you sit out in the pasture, namely Dixie licks with the wheels on them?
I am not sure, but I think even the Dixie Licks products can be formulated with insect growth regulator. Ask your supplier. Usually the supplier can find out whether they either can specially mix it for you or if it comes naturally that way.
Any more questions? If not, I'd like to thank Dr. Hinkle and everybody for coming. We appreciate her time and her excellent presentation.